These are 10 episodes where Brian Griffin deserved to go to jail. The 10th episode being the Woof of Wall Street, which unfortunately doesn't include Margot Robbie. The very first scene of the episode has Brian walking in on Stewie, who has filled his room with every single coin-operated horse and quahog, so he doesn't have to wait in line anymore. Brian isn't confused about Stewie being on a unicorn, but he is confused about how a 1-year-old could possibly afford all of them.
Investing! I invest in the stock market.
Always one to prove he's the smartest guy in the room, Brian has to disagree with Stewie about how fair the stock market is, using the help of a teleprompter, of course. So they move on, and Brian later goes to pick up Stewie from preschool, where he pulls out of his parking spot and into the back of Consuela's car. No. Did I nail it? Brian immediately drives off from the scene since he doesn't have insurance. You know, for a guy who preaches about his intelligence all the time, he sure can make stupid decisions. Stewie tells him he can get him a hefty return on the $100 to pay for the damages if Brian lets him invest in the stock market. The dog caves within a few seconds. Well done sticking to your original stance, Brian. Stewie manages to not only get Brian $1,000 back to fix his car, but also an extra $1,000 in profit. Brian is seeing dollar signs in his eyes. He must learn how to invest in the market. Stewie agrees to teach him on one condition. Brian must teach him the art of gymkata, the fusion of gymnastics and karate. Sounds legit.
No, Stewie. I won't do that. It's too dangerous.
But, like with every other thing he's ever said, Brian goes back on his word and teaches Stewie. It doesn't take long for Brian to start to see returns on his investments, but he vows to keep his morals and donate $1 for each dollar he makes to cancer research. And you'll never guess what. He goes back on this too, and instead rents a Ferrari with Stewie. Later in the episode, Brian takes Stewie to a new potential investor, a shady-looking Korean business that makes protein shakes. Alarm bells are ringing in Stewie's head as he sees boarded up windows and security guards outside, and he's right to be worried because when he walks inside, he finds out exactly why the company is so cheap to invest in.
They're made of dog meat.
Because he lacks morals of any kind, Brian still agrees to a meeting with the company. Hell, even Stewie said no after seeing this. So Brian's basically making it clear he has no issue with animal abuse and illegal workplace practices, even with his own kind, as long as he gets rich from it. He walks in ready for the meeting, only to be given an investor's rag that is laced with chloroform, knocking the dog out instantly. He wakes up to find himself locked in a cage along with the other dogs he'd seen earlier. Well, well, well. Would you look at that, Brian? Stewie realizes Brian is missing and goes on a rescue mission. He stealths his way into the factory, only to be met with security guards who are dragging Brian to his certain death. But that's no issue for Stewie, who lands on a pommel horse in Lycra before cranking up the volume of Life is a Highway and taking out the guard using gymkata. Wait, that was real?
Stewie! Oh my God, thank you!
I must learn this art. Brian does apologize to Stewie, the only good thing he does in this episode, but he still blames the evils of Wall Street. Stewie instantly calls out Brian for blaming everyone but himself, explaining that he's been in the business his whole life and never once folded like Brian did.
Money is the root of all evil.
No, it's not. It's just you.
Thank you, Stewie, for speaking on behalf of all of us. Christmas Crime is the episode that's going in the number 9 spot because who doesn't love a bit of criminal activity around the holidays? Easily the most excited person around the holiday season is Stewie, who has just seen the latest toy to go on his wish list, a happy asking panda doll. Because he's unable to ever let people be happy, Brian launches into a rant about commercialism around the holidays. Firstly, he's a 1-year-old, let him be happy. And secondly, why is this the only argument you ever have, Brian? So the family wraps themselves up and heads out to the quahog tree lighting ceremony, dragging a reluctant Brian with them.
A religious display on government property. Can't believe this is what my tax dollars are paying for.
And I can't believe you're still complaining, Brian. As well as emptying the contents of his hip flask, Brian also empties the majority of the bar and drunkenly stumbles around the clam, forcing his views about the holiday and commercialism on anyone who isn't willing to listen. Quagmire tries to get him to actually name a specific issue that he has with the holiday, and when he can't, he storms out of the bar and drives himself home. He would have made it home had his body not been made up of 98% Jack Daniels. Instead, he falls asleep at the wheel and crashes into the town's nativity scene.
Why couldn't I have hit the court-ordered menorah instead?
Okay, adding anti-Semitism to the list of reasons I hate Brian. Worried he's going to be accused of a hate crime, Brian tries to hide the evidence of the wreckage in a Spirit Airlines parking lot since that's the one place all banged-up cars go to live. Thanks to Brian's stellar acting and inability to control his tone, Stewie instantly connects the dots and works out that the dog is behind the broken nativity scene that's being reported on the news. It takes one question from Stewie for Brian to fess up to the crime. Stewie offers to run away with him, but before they can even start to plan, the mayor shows up to question where Brian was the night of the crime. He lies about being at a food bank and relaxing at home, which somehow the mayor buys. Since he's a dog, the mayor asks for his help in tracking down who was responsible. The pair work the case together, and Brian seemingly clears himself of any connections to that night. Fast forward slightly, and the mayor announces that Christmas is being canceled until the person responsible is found. So Brian does the honorable thing and turns himself in. Oh, wait, sorry. I was letting my imagination run wild there. Brian does not say jack squat to anyone, leaving the fate of Christmas in Stewie's hands. Stewie texts the mayor, tipping him off to the location of a banged-up car in a Spirit Airline parking lot containing the destroyed nativity scene. Having found all the proof he needs, Mayor Wild Wild West returns the car to its owner.
No way! No way! You didn't even hide the evidence?
In one of the more clear-cut cases you'll ever see, Brian gets arrested. Finally! The family visits him since it's Christmas Eve, but promptly leaves as soon as he starts spurting out the same old crap about commercialism. At first, he loves being behind bars on Christmas Day, but he starts to rethink his decision when he sees how happy everyone is on the day. Realizing that joy isn't the worst thing in the world, duh, Brian tries to make amends by offering to fix the nativity scene when the mayor lets him know he's free to go.
Huh?
It's like he killed him all over again.
At number 8 on the list is a season 14 episode titled Scammed Yankees. Brian is interrupted during his very busy day of doing absolutely nothing since he's unemployed, unmotivated, and a waste of space. Whoa, sorry, too harsh. Anyway, Brian is interrupted and frustrated at how loud and obnoxious Meg and her friends are being and goes to complain to Stewie about it.
Well, not everybody can be as fascinating as you, Brian.
Honestly, the best part about making this list was getting to rewatch every time Stewie humbles Brian. Just perfection. Just perfection. Chef's kiss. Mwah. When Meg asks if he can drive her friends to school, he agrees, knowing that will at least get them out of the house despite how annoying the car journey is. One of the girls leaves behind her gym bag, forcing Brian to take her bag into the girls' locker room, a task that I'm sure was hard for him. He goes to leave, but locks eyes with one of the hottest bodies he's seen in a while. He's all but drooling until he realizes that the body belongs to Meg's friend Patty. But knowing she's Meg's friend and a high school student, Brian does the right thing and leaves her alone. Nah, I'm just kidding. He had no interest in Patty before, but as we all know, Brian is the biggest scumbag when it comes to women, so seeing her body changes his opinion of the girl.
Firm butt, great rack. She's in high school.
Which is the entire moral dilemma of the episode. Granted, Patty is 18, only just, but she's a high school student and Brian is about 50 in dog years. It's weird, it's disturbing, it's all kinds of wrong, and it shouldn't take a baby to let him know this. The other issue, as though this one isn't big enough, is his actions that follow. Brian pretends to care about Meg's life so that he can learn more about Patty and plan what moves he can make on the girl. With new knowledge at his disposal, Brian follows Meg and her friends to the mall, which is where his performance of a lifetime starts. He's surprised to bump into them there and shows off all the Build-A-Bears he's made for the cancer kids. He offers one to Patty and successfully pulls at her heartstrings before asking if she wants to split a meal with him at Panda Express. Step 1 complete. Step 2 of his plan is getting a date with Patty. God help me when I say this, which he manages to do. He picks her up from school, loads a Smash Mouth CD into the car, and sets off for a date at the cinema. We thankfully don't have to sit through the movie date, but we do cut to the pair stargazing on the hood of his Prius. How romantic. He uses his cheesiest pickup lines, as well as ones that will have you throwing up everywhere.
You're so deep.
I bet you're pretty deep, too.
Hey, 911, I'd like to report a crime. Brian reaches step 3 in his plan, get Patty naked, and well, you know how it goes. Before things get way too out of hand, Meg drives up to put a stop to things. She tells her friend that Brian is only being kind because of her body, which Patty initially doesn't understand since Meg always calls her dumpy. But as Meg explains, that's only because she's scared Patty won't be her friend when she becomes popular. So the two friends walk off together, and Brian is left unsatisfied and $18 poorer after a wasted date.
Oh, come on!
At number 7 is The Finer Strings, an episode where Brian takes the role of a carer. It sounds promising, but just you wait. Lois worries about her dad's cataracts as he mistakes Bryce Dallas Howard for Jessica Chastain at a high school play. In his defense, I get this wrong all the time. When he also mistakes Carrot Top for Jessica Chastain, Lois decides enough is enough and forces him into getting the surgery. The surgery is a success, but he's left temporarily blinded, which allows Lois to lie about how many family members showed up to support him. If you couldn't couldn't tell, he's not the most loved grandpa. Dr. Hartman advises Carter to have someone around to help him during his recovery. Lois lies again and explains that she has no time to help, but does offer Brian up as a service dog. There isn't much that Brian wouldn't do for a chance to impress Lois, so he agrees to move in with Carter while he recovers. It doesn't start off as the most ideal job for Brian, as Carter has a long list of weird jobs to do for him.
Put on this lady wig and help me out of the tub. What?
It's so satisfying watching Brian have to deal with this, working for what he always complains about, rich people. But when he gets to experience helicopter rides and butler service, Brian realizes he can get used to the life of the elite, not in the least bit surprised. Carter's next checkup with Dr. Hartman reveals that his eyes are fully healed, so he no longer has any need for Brian. Without so much as a thanks, Carter leaves Brian in the dust. Brian returns to the Griffin home and struggles to readapt to the real world and Lois's cooking. I have literally no idea how, but Brian comes to the conclusion that he and Carter had become friends, and that he had accidentally offended Carter by offering work rather than friendship.
You're not kidding anyone. We all know you don't care about Carter. You only care about his money.
Get him, Stewie. He invites himself into Carter's home, but instantly gets kicked out. Naturally, he goes to rant to Stewie about how mad he is and fesses up to actually just missing the money and not the friendship. And then he goes on to say one of the wildest things he ever has.
I almost wish Carter was still blind so he'd still need me.
Stewie makes it very clear that he's not blind, which only gives Brian the idea that he could become blind again. Hey, 911, it's me again. To try and get Stewie on board with his plan, Brian lies and tells the baby that Carter said that Stewie would never cut it as a member of One Direction. This is enough to fuel the fire in Stewie, who agrees to help Brian blind Carter. The pair corner him in the locker room coming out of the shower and spray tap water from Flint, Michigan in his eyes. Brian rushes up and acts as a hero, but quickly realizes that the water has done more damage than he was wanting. It's a brutal scene, and Brian tries to apologize for letting money guide him. Why does he always have to let the absolute worst happen before he sees reason? Even the writers aren't interested in seeing how Brian tries to fix his mistakes, as Stewie pulls the lever for a hasty wrap-up, which cuts us to a healed Carter talking about how everyone has learned their lesson from the attack. The trio hug it out, and we're just overlooking Brian trying to permanently blind someone for money, I guess. From one attack on the Peter Schmidt family to another, and the episode at number 6 on the list, Play It Again, Brian. It only takes him 6 seasons, but Brian finally wins an award for an essay he wrote and gets invited to Martha's Vineyard to receive it. Meanwhile, Lois and Peter are experiencing marital difficulties. I know, it was such a surprise to me too. Lois keeps planning dates and lunches out, and Peter keeps ditching her for plans with his friends. As the couple's arguing gets worse, Brian suggests that they join him on a vacation to Martha's Vineyard while he's accepting his award. It's a no-brainer to the couple when Chris announces that he's going to be learning how to play the drums. So their holiday gets off to a relaxing start, with Brian and Lois both making the most of the peace of no kids in the house. Peter, on the other hand, has taken the role of the kid.
I'm gonna go scare some people. Nobody will buy it. There are no sharks out here.
In my opinion, Peter's clearly having a better holiday. But it comes time for the main reason for the vacation, Brian's award. He steps up to give his speech, which is riddled with compliments that are obviously about Lois. This would be a nice gesture to think nothing of if Brian hadn't spent the entirety of the show hitting on Lois. By the end of his speech, Peter stumbles in, drunk to the point that he can barely talk. It's finally enough for Lois, who calls him out for missing yet another huge family event, as well as embarrassing her. The next morning, Peter apologizes for his behavior and promises he'll do better after the ball game is finished. So Lois instead invites Brian to join her for some activities during the day. A bike ride, a walk on the beach, a trip to the carnival, and a romantic track playing in the background. It's the ultimate date day. Not that anyone but Brian is seeing it that way. Because he just loves to take advantage of women when they're in a vulnerable position, Brian offers to rent some movies, order room service, and spend the night with Lois. He does start to question the thoughts in his head when they run a bit too wild, but at the end of the day, Brian is a dog. In both ways. While they settle in for the night, Brian admits that he wrote the essay about Lois. She's flattered, but shows no sign of anything else other than friendship. I cannot stress that part enough. He gets even deeper into how much he respects her and values her in his life before offering her more to drink, even though she admits to being tipsy. Again, I cannot stress the importance of this enough. So what does Brian do to a woman who is drunk, vulnerable, and not interested in him at all? Well, he forces himself on her, of course.
Stop it! What are you doing?
I can't help myself, Lois.
Even though once is enough, it's worth noting insisting that she says no multiple times and he still doesn't stop. She wrestles him off and kicks him out of the room before telling Peter what the dog did the next morning. Peter confronts Brian at the bar after hearing this, but Brian doesn't apologize. Oh no, he blames Peter for treating her like crap and not deserving her. Hey Brian, maybe look in a mirror sometime, yeah? The two end up in a bar brawl before coming to an agreement that nothing like this will ever happen again. A pretty easy get off for Brian if you ask me. He then goes to give Lois a similar apology and she forgives him like nothing happened. You know, it's no wonder this family is so messed up. If you're forgiving assault and almost worse that easily, what else are you gonna be okay with? Lois goes on to admit that she has thought about being with Brian in that way. She even admits that she's had graphic thoughts about them together.
With you, I imagine it would be like doing it with a stuffed animal.
I hate this family. For the number 5 spot, we have Be Careful What You Wish For, an episode that should come with its own trigger warning. Brian picks up a dirty Stewie from daycare who's been left with paint all over him. But according to the baby, that's not so bad since another kid was left in a drawer all day. Okay, red flag number 1. Even worse, the daycare is just someone's house. Brian questions Stewie a little further and calls out an issue when Stewie asks if his teacher tying the kids to a sink while she went out to return a gift was normal. Red flag number 2. He joins Stewie the next morning to see if he's telling the truth, but if anything, Stewie is underselling how bad things are. Brian marches off to find the teacher and give her a piece of his mind, but there's one issue.
Are you Miss Emily?
Yeah, hi. Who are you?
You guessed it, she's hot. Brian's biggest weakness. All reason goes out the window as Brian quickly forgets about the child neglect and instead starts to flirt with the teacher. I'm not going to give Brian a red flag counter because the number would be higher than I could ever count to. He does keep making visits to Stewie, but it's definitely not to check on the kids' welfare. Stewie tells him that Miss Emily hasn't even shown up that day and instead gives him the keys to open the daycare. That's still not enough for Brian though, who defends the teacher to Stewie, telling him that she's doing her best. When Miss Emily shows up and asks Brian how his day at the legal practice he works at went, Stewie finally clocks what Brian is doing and calls him out for his disgusting behavior.
She's teaching you guys independence.
We're one! Independence means we die!
Stewie's pleas and Miss Emily's drinking on the job still do nothing to persuade Brian into helping the abused kids because why would it? Now this is where I lost the tiniest shred of respect I still had for this dog. Stewie returns home with his arm literally hanging out of his socket and explains that he stood up to Miss Emily, demanding that he and the other kids be given a real lunch, and she gave him this in return. It's a 1-year-old with a dislocated shoulder and Brian still refuses to do anything. Like, how am I meant to make that a joke? Brian tries to manipulate Stewie into believing that he slept on his arm funny, but the baby's no idiot. As he cries out for Lois, Brian stops him from telling his mom what's going on since he finally landed a date with Miss Emily. He pops the arm back into the socket and moves on with his day. Later in the episode, he shows up ready for his date, but gets a surprise of his own.
Who was that?
That's my boyfriend, Devin.
As soon as Brian realizes Miss Emily is no longer a dating option, he calls the cops on her. That's right, not chaining kids to sinks, leaving them without food, yanking arms out of sockets. Oh no, it's only worth calling the cops when you can't date a woman. He even has the audacity to call her out on her behavior as she's being taken away, claiming there's a place in hell for people like her. You would know, Brian. You'll be seeing her down there. Stewie doesn't get an apology from Brian, nor does he ask for one. They just walk off, as though nothing had happened.
Man, when she gets to jail, she's gonna be Major Les Chow.
She sure is, Stewie.
Petey IV is the episode at number 4 on the list, which follows up on Brian's controversies in the previous episode. We open with a Survivor-style parody that recaps the events that led up to this episode, as Brian is voted to be moved out of the house following a controversial tweet that made him the pariah of the town. Cut to the current time as Brian is being pushed to get his rent paid. He has no money since his writing career still hasn't taken off. It's only been 16 seasons, give him a chance. He calls his family to mooch off them, but they don't pick up, so he's left with only one option: to get a job. He starts his first day working for the suicide hotline, meeting his coworker, Martha. At this point on the list, do I really need to tell you where this is going? Now, Martha is voiced by Kristen Bell, so I kinda understand where he's coming from. Brian, of course, instantly flirts with his coworker before getting his first call.
Hey, I'm a pathetic dog whose family kicked him out, and I want to kill myself.
I love you so much, Stewie. Not even halfway into the episode, and Brian is already inviting Martha to Netflix and chill. Like a sane and logical woman, she walks off ignoring his offer. But this isn't stopping Brian. In his opinion, just because she won't date him doesn't mean he can't date her in his mind. So he does the next best thing and opens up her Facebook page. He finds some photos that are satisfying enough for him, grabs some hand cream, and, well, you can work out the rest. Nope, I retract my statement. I do not understand where he's coming from. Please don't cancel me. While that mess is happening, Martha is outside reconsidering her decision. Since her therapist has encouraged her to go for things more often, she decides that she should go back in and take a chance on Brian. And the scene she's greeted with is...
Gross! You scumbag!
As anyone would after walking in on that, she leaves. Brian tells his landlord what he's done and how scared he is to lose his job given his financial situation. The landlord advises him to do what he usually does, plant drugs on a person and call the cops. You have got to move out, Brian. He's not initially sold on the idea, but when he realizes his only other option is eviction, he goes for it. You could argue that Brian was pushed into this, but I'm not going to. If this list is anything to go by, he likely would have done it anyway. The next morning arrives and Martha, surprisingly, is ready to forgive Brian. She saw his actions as a compliment. We have got to set our standards higher, people. So yet another woman wronged by Brian is ready to forgive him, but it's too late. Brian's already planted the drugs. He tries to quickly warn her to deny anything that the cops ask her, but they're already there holding up the bag of cocaine hidden in her desk drawer. They don't believe her as she pleads her innocence and moves to take her in. By now, Martha's worked out what's happened. Now, I'm not gonna condone animal abuse, but I will say that watching her push Brian down the stairs was a whole different kind of satisfying. The only thing is, it's not exactly helped her case with the cops. For the number 3 spot on this list, I'm including one of the sickest episodes of Family Guy I have ever seen, Herpe the Love Sore. Stewie joins Brian as he watches the outlaw Josie Wales, specifically a part where Clint Eastwood's character makes a blood brothers pact with the Indian chief. He's never seen this type of bonding before, so Brian explains how people mix their blood as a way to reinforce a closer bond. And, well, there's a certain aspect of the ritual that sounds appealing to Stewie.
Brian, I want you inside me.
You don't have to say it like that.
Never change, Stewie, never change. So Brian agrees to go through with it, and the pair seal their friendship, making Stewie feel a lot more secure, a feeling and decision he'll come to regret the next morning. Stewie wakes up with his lips stuck to his pillow and checks his mirror to see that he has a disgusting sore on his face. Not just any sore, a herpes sore. Clearly, Stewie didn't get a herpes sore in the traditional manner, let's say, so he goes to his most obvious suspect, Brian. But this is where the most disturbing plot twists of the entire show come in. After ripping into Brian, the dog makes his confession.
Okay, fine, I admit it, I gave you herpes.
Brian knew he had herpes and still did the ritual with Stewie. Oh, he also tells Stewie it isn't a big deal because, you know, he hadn't already made this bad enough. So Stewie tries to cover up his STD at daycare, but his disguise could have been a touch more believable, since most 1-year-old babies don't grow a beard overnight. Shocking, I know. It's an easy spot for the teacher who rips off his disguise, exposing his disease to the class who run away in fear. It's not the only difficult interaction Stewie has to have that day as he returns home to tell Rupert that he should probably get himself tested as he has herpes. I'm gonna unpack that in a different video. Chris overhears their conversation and shows off a disgusting herpes sore of his own. Even worse, he also got it from Brian in a Blood Brothers pact. 911? Yeah, I promise this is the last time. So the two pair up to form the ultimate revenge duo and start by interrupting his dates to let the woman know that he's carrying an STD. It's effective, and it's only the beginning. Brian finally says enough is enough when the pair hack his Facebook account and change his name and profile picture to something more fitting. He says he will give them whatever they want to fix things. Chris asks to borrow his Prius to drive to the end of the block and back, and Stewie requests a date with Nev Campbell. Brian can't deliver on the Nev Campbell date for obvious reasons, and Stewie admits that he was just making it hard on the dog because, for the first time in his life, he couldn't trust him.
I let you down. I guess I was just too embarrassed to admit I had herpes.
Is Family Guy really trying to manipulate me into thinking that giving a baby an STD is excusable out of embarrassment? The episode wraps up with Stewie realizing that he now has to live the rest of his life with herpes, but Brian reminds him that it's not that bad since it only flares up during stressful times. I mean, every day is a stressful time with this family. Married with Cancer is the episode at number 2 on this list, and trust me when I say, it was so hard choosing between these final two. Even though Brian's fedora is enough to get him put in jail, that's not his biggest crime in this episode. Brian makes an instant connection with Jess, a woman who shares all the same views as him, which is a rare occurrence. Jess admits that she has non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a type of cancer, but that doesn't bother Brian, who invites her to spend the night with him. It must have been one hell of a night since Brian can't even explain what they did on late night TV, and Jess admits that she only woke up to her freaky side after being diagnosed. I don't even want to know what's on her bucket list, given how quickly Brian asked to help her complete it all. So the two set off to cross everything off the list by sleeping just about everywhere everywhere in the world, traumatizing anyone they come across, myself included. For Brian, it's not all about sleeping with Jess, as he invites her for dinner with the family who can't help but make constant cancer puns. How tasteful.
I prefer the limbs.
I got a lymphoma.
Not willing to let her sit through that, Brian drags her out of the house but ends up rushing her to the hospital when she passes out in the parking lot. The doctor announces that her cancer hasn't responded to the treatment, meaning she only has 2 weeks left to live. To make sure she gets to live out one of her dreams, Brian offers to marry her. It would have been a kind and heartfelt offer had Brian not milked the whole event and even had a news report done about the wedding and his heroic and unselfish act. But the big day comes and the pair are wed for the rest of Jess's short life, except it's not going to be a short life. Right after they're announced as married, Jess's doctor interrupts to deliver the good news that her latest test results show she's going to live. Good news, right? Right, Brian? Nope. Brian has an existential crisis and Jess gets started on enjoying her life, eating her way through the entire room service menu now that she has an appetite again. So Brian moves in with his new wife in her rundown apartment and begins their married life together, but he's already started getting the ick.
Stewie, I've got to get out of this. You were right all along, okay? I'm not ready to be married.
You know, I could take this as just cold feet if I didn't know Brian's usual ways. Of course, now that Jess has put on weight, Brian has lost interest in her. Go figure. But as Stewie points out, divorcing her wouldn't go over well after he paraded their love all over the news. Jess continues to heal, but Brian couldn't care less, even more so when her Christian mom comes to live with them during her recovery. This is the last straw for Brian. As the pair go out for dinner, Jess forgets to chew her food and starts to choke, and Brian doesn't move a muscle. Even when he realizes that she's choking to death, he hesitates. He tries to Google how to do the Heimlich maneuver, but instead pulls up a Heim song. He's still not making any rush to save her or call for help though, he just watches as his wife chokes to death.
Somebody call 911!
I already have, Brian, multiple times. He at least has the decency to show up to her funeral, but given that he quite literally watched her die and did nothing to help her, it was the least he could do, so he gets no credit from me on that one. He lies in his eulogy, stating that he wishes for nothing more than to have more time with Jess, and wouldn't you know it, his wish comes true. Jess comes back to life, and I just want to say, whichever genie granted him that wish, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Karma is a wonderful thing. Good luck dealing with that next episode, Brian. And so we make it to the worst of the worst, the #1 position on the list, which goes to, drumroll please, Leggo My Meg-O. Meg gets invited to spend a semester in Paris with her friend Ruth, which she instantly accepts. She manages to win over her parents, who are first worried about the cost, by announcing that she's got enough saved up that she can fund the trip herself. The girls make it to Paris and are instantly met with a shady man who's claiming to represent France for their welcome party. Do I need to do a red flag counter again? He offers to share a cab with them to their hotel, and they accept. Meg calls Peter to let him know that she's settling in, but this is when things take a dark turn. Meg watches Ruth get kidnapped and tries to hide, but she's found and kidnapped too. Having heard all this, Peter tries to intimidate her kidnapper on the phone, but realizes he's way out of his depth.
These guys are serious.
Lois, Meg's dead.
Neither Peter, Lois, nor the FBI can do anything to save Meg until she's been missing for longer than 96 hours, so Brian and Stewie take it upon themselves to fly to France and save their sister. They retrace her steps by starting at the hotel she was staying at. With the help of Google Earth, they find the stranger at the airport. They attempt to question him, but fail to get any answers thanks to a bus running him over. The first guy always dies in these movies. Clues on his body lead them to the kidnapper's hideout, where they try to find out Meg's location, but instead they end up in a brutal fight. Stewie forces the answer out of one of the men and heads upstairs to look for Meg. There's no Meg, only her look-alike, but the kidnapped girl reveals that Meg was taken to an auction. Knowing that it's their only chance, Brian and Stewie go undercover in the auction, with Stewie putting on his best moves to Katy Perry's California Girls.
Ah, that's right. You like that?
Take my money. Although they get caught in their disguises, they do catch sight of Meg, who's up next for auction. I know this seems like a weird one to have at #1 since Brian's saving Meg's life, but I promise you, the worst is coming. Brian and Stewie escape from the auction house and follow the car that's driving Meg away to her new owner. Once they get onto the boat she's being kept on, Stewie arms them both for protection. That's the key word, Brian. Protection. Brian finds out that using a gun is just like playing a video game and takes down the bodyguards.
I'm kind of good at this. Later, dink.
Protection, Brian, not murder. Yeah, so Brian just straight up murders an innocent waiter in cold blood. Unprovoked. It's murder, and he faces no consequences. While this is happening, Meg meets her captor, who hasn't actually bought her as a slave, but as a wife for his son. When Meg sees the son, she realizes that this was a pretty good deal for herself. Given her love life on this show, it's no surprise. But just as she says yes to his proposal, Stewie interrupts to supposedly save her life.
Stewie?
Hi, Meg.
Meg is reunited with her family, and since Stewie went all Men in Black and used a neuralizer on her, she doesn't remember that it was the baby and the dog that saved her, meaning that nobody remembered Brian's act of murder either. Seriously, if murder isn't enough to get him jail time, I don't know what is. I will give him props for saving Meg before things got worse like they did for Ruth, who had her tongue cut out, but that is it. I knew he was bad before making this list, but this has only reinforced how truly bad Brian is as a character on this show.